Jerry Root, welcome to Apollos Watered.
Thank you. I'm really grateful to be here, Travis. And it's good to reconnect with you after a few years.
Yeah, the pandemic's kind of wreaked havoc on everybody's lives. The COVID years have been kind of forgotten. I feel like I can't even think about the last few years, but
it's nice to see faces again.
It is. It really is. It really is.
I find out who had braces and who didn't have braces and all that thing. It's wonderful.
Well, are you ready for the Fast Five?
I don't know if I'm ready for anything.
Okay, here's the first question.
I used to be an athlete. I used to be relatively fast, but now I'm old and I just actually I need a cane. Can I walk through the Fast Five with a cane?
You can walk to the Fast Five with a cane. So it is kind of in between seasons as we're recording this, but I'm going to ask you this: pumpkin spice or peppermint mocha?
I think I'd go with the pumpkin spice. It's a little more subtle in its flavors and so on. I like subtlety.
All right. How about this question? You are a man when fill in the blank.
You're a man when you can look at your own mistakes, own them, ask forgiveness where you need to ask forgiveness, learn from your failures, and grow so you don't make those same mistakes again.
That's really good. I thought you were going to say bench press 400 pounds.
I used to do that, but now I can't roll 5.
I like the first answer, though. That's really, really good on owning your mistakes. That's actually very, very good. Now, how long were you a teacher for? I know you've retired from teaching. Well, retired, and I put air quotes around that because you're still teaching. But how many years were you in the classroom?
Well, I was a pastor for 23 years, mostly in college ministry. But in those 23 years, I was an adjunct professor all through for 16 of those years. And then I became a professor full-time for 25 years and was a full professor at Wheaton College.
That's a long time.
Yeah,
that's a long time.
I'm an old guy, you know. It's funny because when I retired from Wheaton College, I got a call from the archaeology department and they told me they had shelf space for me.
Because you're a fossil?
Yeah. I put on a little bit of weight, so I thought the shelf might cave in. So I do that, you know.
Well, so since you've been a professor, what's the funniest classroom experience you've ever had?
It was when I was lecturing one time, and a student came up to me while I was lecturing and whispered in my ear. And then he went and sat down, and I had to turn around and pull up my zipper.
I laugh at that because I was speaking at a camp of high school students, and I was doing a Q&A where they would pass questions up, and and I'm reading the questions out loud, and it says, Travis, your zipper is down. I was in front of everybody. So yeah, that was quite embarrassing. And I've had that actually while I was preaching. Someone in the back made motion and I had to definitely take my jacket off and fix that. It was embarrassing. So embarrassing. Okay. Number 4, if you could own a pub, I mean, you're a C.S. Lewis scholar, you love Tolkien, you love the Inklings, but if you could own a pub, what would be the name of the pub and where would it be?
Well, I already do own the pub.
What?
Yeah, it's in my basement. I have a full pub in my basement. I live on Shady Lane, so we call it the Shady Lane Pub. I'm a shady character on Shady Lane. Next time you're by, I'll take you down to the Shady Lane Pub. I know the owner. The drinks are free.
I like that.
Shady Lane Pub. It's interesting. The Eagle and Child is for sale.
Is it for how much, though?
I don't know. You should call them and see. Maybe you could do your podcast from the Eagle and Child.
Wow. That would be interesting. Oh, that would be very interesting. Okay, number 5. Here we go. Craziest ministry experience you've ever had?
Well, I've had a lot of them. Craziest ministry. I mean, you could go so many ways with that. You know, these things that happen and you say, wow, there was some real coincidence there. Just a coincidence. Don't let it build your faith, you know, that sort of thing. But you also have ones where you see people do stupid things. I was out sharing Jesus with people the night before the Rose Parade. And in Colorado Boulevard in Pasadena, it's like there's 1 million people out there.
Mm.
It's crazy. We were walking through Pasadena City College, and we saw this guy lying in his own vomit.
Ew.
And we picked him up and we started cleaning him off, and we put him on a bench and so on. And we started sharing Jesus with him. As soon as we started sharing Jesus, he started cussing us out. He was so angry. He says, "You put me back where you found me." I said, "You were laying in your own vomit. You put me back. I don't want anything to do with this Jesus stuff." So we laid him back down in his own vomit. And I think that's the way it is. Why would anybody refuse the message that the God of the universe loves them with intensity? That he's done everything to set what's wrong right in their life in Christ. And why would they want to just go back to their own vomit? It's a little bit like Pharaoh. Remember, there was a plague of the frogs, and he says to Moses, "Okay, I'm done with the frogs, get rid of them." And Moses says, "When?" And Pharaoh says, "Tomorrow." So he was willing to spend one more night with the frogs. I think some of the craziest things I've ever seen is how people will reject God for the mess they've made for themselves. Understand it, but I guess I should understand it. Sometimes I do stuff like that too. God help us all.
Mm. Well, I mean, I also think of as a dog returns to his vomit, so the fool returns to his folly. I mean, that's a very appropriate passage. So let's hear the Jerry Root story. I mean, as you alluded to, you're an athlete from California. I mean, you've done ministry in a lot of different ways, college students, professor, C.S. Lewis scholar, but give us the Jerry Root story.
If you say I was an athlete, that's right. You have to believe it by faith now, though. But yeah, I grew up in almost South Central Los Angeles. You know, Los Angeles, the original street was Olvera Street. Alameda runs right alongside of it, goes all the way to San Pedro. If you went straight south from the central street in LA, down Alameda, I lived 3 blocks off of Alameda between Florence and Firestone. If you saw the movie Bloods and Crips Made in America, the documentary about how the gang started in LA, the first gang was called the Slauson Street Club. The police started calling it a gang. So it was a Slauson Street gang. My high school was on Slauson Street. And I played high school football with guys that got free televisions during the Watts riots. And a guy was shot in the leg at the end of my street. It's interesting though, because they got free TV, so now I could watch color TV. It was kind of nice, it wasn't all that bad. You have to think about it. But I grew up there. People didn't go to college, many from where I grew up. Some did, but not many. I didn't really have any interest. I wanted to play sports, so I went to college to play football. And I ended up getting accepted to a school that I think at that time you had 2 options. They would accept you. You had to pay tuition and you had to breathe. They would negotiate the breathing part, but the tuition was non-negotiable. So I got accepted on probation, and I went there. And the first week I was there, my older brother, who was a Christian, invited me to a Campus Crusade for Christ meeting, and I heard the gospel, and it blew me away. I didn't know that I could be loved by the God of the universe unconditionally. What does the Hound of Heaven by Francis Thompson? He says, "Human love demands human meriting. How hast thou merited? Of all man's dingiest clay, thou art the dingiest clot. Whom wilt thou find to love ignoble thee, save me, save only me?" And when I heard that God loved me like that, I just freaked out. And that he forgave me of my sins. Nobody had to tell me I was a sinner. I was too well aware. And it was good news for me. So I become a Christian, and I made it my goal to share Christ with every guy I played football with in college. And every year I'd share with them all. I saw about 15 guys a season come to faith. Some of them went on to really live strong lives for Christ. Some of them just sort of wimped along over the years and so on. But nevertheless, my friends would ask me questions, and I never heard of these questions. I never asked them. If God's good and all powerful, why does evil exist in the universe? I had never once asked that question before as a Christian. I'm ashamed to say it. I've written a book about it. It's a matter that concerns me. But my friends asked the questions, and I'd say, I don't know the answer to that. but I won't leave a stone unturned until I can find a substantive answer that will help you. I don't know if we ever get to the last word on any of these questions because we're such pea brains, and we're talking about big things. Remember Lucy? She says to Aslan when she encounters him the first time, the Christ figure, the Lion of Narnia, when she encounters him for the first time on her second visit to Narnia and Prince Caspian, she says, Aslan, you're bigger. He says, oh, no, child, I am not. But every year you grow, you'll find me bigger. And every attempt we make to answer these questions, people ask, we keep finding God's bigger. And my faith was growing. I would dig for the answers to the questions. I would go to my friends and I'd say, remember when you asked me that question? Your life really matters to me. And I went and dug, and this is what I found. How could they refuse listening to your answer when they asked you the question and you did all that work to help them with the answer? Sometimes they'd just ask another question, but every time they asked the question, as I dug, I started growing in my faith. Many times they asked the question, and when I shared with them the answer, they trusted Christ. But a lot of times in the literature, I saw a name crop up, C.S. Lewis. Who's this guy? I liked his answers that I read as people were quoting him. My older sister was a Christian, and she was reading Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe to the fifth grade class she was teaching at her school. And she told me one night when I was visiting her over dinner, the plot of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I said, what, there's books like this? And I think I read 6 books before I went to college, not counting comic books. And all of a sudden, I read through the Bible from cover to cover, something I've tried to do every year since. And I start reading Lewis voraciously. And I read Surprised by Joy, his autobiography. And that's the book that hooked me because he talked about the deep longings of his heart and the quest to find the object of that longing. I knew the longings existentially. He gave me a vocabulary for my own soul. There was a professor at Whittier College where I attended, and there were only 3 professors who I knew who were Christians. And this philosophy professor was very respected, and he was requiring some Lewis books for his classes. So I basically majored in that professor. I wasn't a philosophy major. I was a PE major, but I had enough units for a minor in philosophy, except for one Eastern religion class where I would have had that minor. But this guy really helped me too. So I go to seminary. They had the seminary I went to, Talbot Graduate School of Theology. They accepted a few students on probation. I mean, my academic interest in college was to stay eligible. I didn't know how to spell it, but it meant everything. and so I had grades to keep me eligible, but not grades to get into grad school. But Talbot said they would set aside a few people that they would let in on probation because maybe God was doing a work in their life and maybe they were a late bloomer or something like that. I think I took the entire quota when I came to Talbot. So they let me in. And when I got in, I did better in grad school, but I had to write a thesis. And there was no way I was going to write a thesis on the use of the optative mood in the Greek text of Philemon. It just wasn't going to work. But they said I could write on C.S. Lewis. So I wrote on C.S. Lewis. So that was the first time I put pen to paper about Lewis. And then I started writing on him. Eventually, I did my doctorate on Lewis and started lecturing on him. And I used to teach a course at Biola University on C.S. Lewis. I actually taught there for about 32 years as a visiting professor. But I taught a class every semester for that. At that time, I was living in Santa Barbara. If you believe in Jesus, when you die, you go to Santa Barbara. I would drive down once a week, and every semester taught a class. I'd have 200 students in that class every semester. I had 1,600 students in 4 years in that class. And I started teaching on Lewis. I taught at him in a community college here in Illinois back when I was pastoring for 10 years, Lewis courses. And then when I came to Wheaton, of course, I was teaching Lewis every semester. And again, I've lectured on him at 79 universities in 19 different countries. And it's interesting to me because I still think of myself as that inner city kid who was a PE major. We're defined by our early experience. But if nobody was interested in Lewis, I'd be all in. and he opens more than wardrobe doors. Lewis was for me, my skeletal structure through the liberal arts. You read Lewis, he's so persuasive, but he doesn't persuade by coercing. He persuades by standing shoulder to shoulder with his readers, and he defines and describes things in such a way that you're fascinated by the things he's talking about. So through Lewis, I started reading Homer. I started reading Plato, Aristotle, started reading the early church fathers, reading Athanasius, reading Augustine, reading Aquinas, reading Dante, my word, reading Chaucer and Milton and Philip Sidney and Edmund Spenser and Milton. I think, did I say Milton already? Shakespeare. All these authors, you keep reading. Then his near contemporaries, George MacDonald, G.K. Chesterton, Tolkien, Charles Williams, my heavens. And the whole thing has been a liberal arts opportunity for me, but it's been breathtaking. Every step of the way, it's filled with wonder. G.K. Chesterton once said, "The world will never starve for want of wonders, only for want of wonder." And Lewis opens up wonder. He feeds your curiosities, and curiosity should always lead to the quest for answers. These answers should lead to awe and wonder should always break forth in worship. So he's been a wonderful experience. Boethius, too, I have to mention Boethius. Lewis said that he was the most influential author on medieval literature after the Bible. And he said a person wasn't considered educated up to 200 years ago, I think it was. He said 150, but let's give it some extra time.
Yeah.
If they didn't know Boethius. And it's true. You read Milton, you read Chaucer, Chaucer has one character in Troilus and Cressida, Pander, who recounts the entire argument of the book. Dante is referring to Boethius. They're all referring to Boethius. Nobody even reads him. Nobody even knows he exists anymore. And I think the reason why is because the Enlightenment put up a mesh that filtered out a lot of these great authors of the past. We don't read them. It's unfortunate. We're bereft. It's our poverty. We're impoverished because we don't read all these authors. But nevertheless, Boethius, I'd count him one of the top 10 books I've ever read, his Consolation of Philosophy. So anyway, that's kind of my story, and I ended up getting my doctorate. I did my doctorate in the Open University through the Oxford Center for Mission Studies. But my two first supervisors were Basil Mitchell, who was the Oxford University philosopher, and Lyle Dorset, who was a great C.S. Lewis scholar. And then for the last draft of my thesis, I had two rhetoricians help me hone the argument. Steve Beebe, a brilliant communication theorist, and also Jeff Davis, who's the Dean of the Humanities here at Wheaton College. So that's kind of my story. I'm married to Claudia, my wife. It'll be 48 years in January, and we have 4 kids, 4 married children, and 15 grandchildren. So at Christmas, we have to decide, do we buy the grandkids presents or do we make the house payment? So my wife and I are going to move into a tent.
That's good.
That story.
So going back to C.S. Lewis for a minute, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk with you. We got connected via a thing we called the Brotherhood of the Briar, which is a group of guys that would come together on Thursday evenings and discuss philosophy and poetry and just be around a fire and have fun and really just try to engage the mind. Why is Lewis such a figure that he's hard to nail down? He transcends categories, and yet people love him across the spectrum. What is it about Lewis that draws us in or draws people in, and why should we read him today?
Well, there's several things that happen there. One, he sticks with mere Christianity. So you can find people who are Orthodox, Catholic, Coptics, Protestants of all stripes, and they read him because at the core, they have something that still allows them to be called Christian, whichever branch of the Christian faith they're in. And Lewis sticks to that core. He's not afraid to talk about the fringe, but he has a difference between what he says is a sure word versus opinion. And opinion is based on probability rather than certainty. It's subject to doubt, and reasonable people could differ over matters of opinion. Lewis doesn't fight over matters of opinion, but he holds a firm ground to mere Christianity. I think that's good. The other thing too is that Lewis said to a bunch of students in a lecture he gave called On the English Syllabus. It's published in the book called Rehabilitations, a Lewis book that nobody ever reads, but nevertheless, it's a good book. And in that, he said to the students, we have fulfilled our whole duty to you if we could help you see some given track of reality. We tend to be projective. We tend to project ourselves on our world, and we treat the world like a ventriloquist treats its dummy. We're basically uttering our own ideas through whatever it is we look at. Lewis says, no, you need to see this thing outside of yourself, the world outside of yourself, that you can grow into that world rather than atrophy into your own. And he has a line in his mature literary critical work called An Experiment Criticism, probably his last literary Discarded Image was his last one, but one of his last literary critical works. He says, in coming to understand anything, we must reject the facts as they are for us in favor of the facts as they are. So Lewis looks at the real world and he's describing it. And a person begins to see something of the robustness of that world, and they become interested in it, and they break out of the dungeon of self. Lewis helps us with that. Not only that, Lewis writes with such descriptive precision. He trained as a poet. He was not successful as a poet. I think his poetry is great. My academic friends don't think it's great. And they think that the fact that Lewis was rejected as a poet was a great thing because it drove him to prose, and we've all benefited by his prose. But I like his poetry. But nevertheless, he trained as a poet. A poet has to let each word count for more. You know, the narrative author can put together a paragraph to communicate an idea, and a poet will try and capture that same idea in a few words. And Lewis picks his words carefully. And there's little ambiguity with Lewis, and I think that's helpful. The other thing is he's such an imaginative author, so that even in books like Mere Christianity, he makes a propositional point and then he depicts it somehow imaginatively. And he said, the imaginative man in me is older, more continuously operative than the rational man. It's not that he's downplaying the rational side, but he loved the employment of the imagination. As a child, he was a lover of the myths. He was a lover of story, and he employs story, and he sees the value of story as well. So just to depict this a little bit, George MacDonald, an author who influenced Lewis, once said in his novel, Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood, we do not have souls. We are souls. We have bodies. You tell a child he has a soul, he thinks like anything else he has, his books, his keys, his lunch, whatever, that he could leave it behind. He thinks when he dies, he goes to the grave and his soul goes off someplace else. MacDonald says, no, tell the child he is a soul and he has a body. And when he dies, he goes to heaven and he leaves behind his body like clipped hair on a barbershop floor, for those who still go to barbershops, right?
Neither one of us.
I say, why should I have to pay as much as that other guy over there? The barber goes, it's finder's fee. We got to find it before we could clip it. So anyway, so what is the soul? And I think I could lay out proofs of the existence of the soul, the immaterial part of what it is to be human. I've read a lot of books on it and stuff like that. But basically, traditionally, we've said the soul, the immaterial part of us, has a thinking part, reason. It has a choosing part, volition. And it has a feeling part, the emotion. And even coming from an academic environment, I would suggest to you, the reason is hands down the weakest of those three. If I make a bad choice, a bad decision, my reason doesn't kick in and say, Jerry, that's stupid. You follow that line, all you're going to do is hurt yourself and hurt people who care for you. No, my reason, being weak, is marshaled by my will to start making excuses and rationalizations for the bad choice. Lewis wrote, continued disobedience to conscience makes conscience blind. Aristotle put it this way, vice is unconscious of itself. He takes a word, akrasia. Krasia is the Greek word for command. Put the alpha negation, you lose command of your moral life if you make bad decisions and rationalize them. You lose moral clarity, you lose moral sight. And so basically, having made these excuses, Lewis says reason stands like almost a dragon sentry before my heart, keeping things from getting to that heart through its excuses and rationalizations. And Lewis says sometimes story gets past the watchful dragon. And so Lewis gains a hearing even in a skeptical world because of his use of the imaginative depictions in the stories that people who have resistance to anything to Christian faith will let down their guard, and all of a sudden they can begin to hear and see. And I think that's why he has such great appeal, because of these there's more reasons as well, but we'll stop there. I've been talking too long.
No, it's my contention that we've lost a lot of what the Christian imagination is, because the imagination is such a powerful tool that we have at our disposal. And I think that Lewis, as you mentioned, already had tapped into that in a way that not too many authors have. Have we lost the idea of a Christian imagination in our contemporary culture, that we've been bombarded with images and we're just so caught up in having the entertainment done to us that we've really lost our ability to imagine? Or are all the images that we have in front of us indicative of imaginations that are becoming more awake?
I don't know exactly. I know I've done work on Lewis and the imagination. You talked about the Brotherhood of the Briar and that Pipes group that meets at my house for discussion. And there was a guy at that group named Mark Neal, and Mark had written a couple of really good articles on Lewis. And in my study of Lewis, I found that he writes about the imagination at least 31 different ways. They say Eskimos live in snow 24/7, have 30 words for snow, because they can nuance it better. And Lewis, I think, who lived in the imagination, had all these words. So I said to Mark, you and I need to do a book on this. So we wrote a book called The Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis. We're going to do 31 descriptors on these different imagination. The publisher gave good advice. They said, no, just do 15, but show how Lewis works it out in one of his books. And I think that was a good editorial comment. So we did, with the appendix then giving the other ones that we didn't describe. But the fact that he looks at this in such nuanced ways, and all things human are fallen. So there could be broken ways that the imagination is used that are not for our good. And Lewis talks about those too. But most of them are helpful. And he'll talk about the fact that, he borrows a lot of these from different authors, but Samuel Taylor Coleridge talked about primary imagination or common sense. You have 5 gates of empirical data coming in: touch, sight, smell, taste, and hearing. And all that stuff is coming in all the time, and it's just a cacophony of information. But something makes sense out of them: primary imagination or common sense. And that's itself not an empirical activity. It's an activity of the imagination. You have bad uses of the imagination, what Lewis calls transforming imagination. It's basically psychological projection. It doesn't make any difference what the thing is. I project on it what I need it to be because I want to sustain myself in this sort of acrasia. But you also have what he calls, from Shakespeare, the penetrating imagination. He writes an essay, Variation in Shakespeare. Penetrating imagination seeks to go deeper into a thing. He says Shakespeare can, in one sonnet, maybe have 7 metaphors. He's just getting all around the thing, showing the nuance and the complexity. And he writes another piece called Similes in Dante, where Dante does something similar. But then he talks about the realizing imagination that he thought was a medieval form. And it's like the thing in bud that opens up to a wider flower. And the realizing imagination takes it out wider. He talks about the great thing about medieval stories is that they embellish the old things that came to them. So you take Homer's embellished by Virgil, Virgil's embellished by Boccaccio and the Decameron. Chaucer takes Boccaccio and embellishes it, and Troilus and Cressida. We do it today, but we're probably not as aware of it because we're not aware of the old material. But you take a story like West Side Story, it's Romeo and Juliet retold. You take August Rush, And it's basically Oliver Twist retold. The Robin Williams character is the Fagin character. You take Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? That's the Odyssey retold. You take Lion King. It's basically Hamlet retold. You take Bridget Jones' Diary. It's Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice retold. Colin Firth plays Darcy, a character named Darcy in both stories in the BBC edition and the Bridget Jones thing. It's like the director's taking a 2x4 and hitting the reader or the watcher over the head by saying, I'm just retelling Jane Austen here in case you don't get it. I've got Colin Firth playing a guy by the same name in both stories. We're embellishing stories all the time. That's the realizing imagination. You've got others too, the material imagination. You've got a host of others are very, very interesting. And as we study these things and see how Lewis nuances these things so well, then it draws us in. And it draws us in this way. Any development in thought will require some use of the imagination. A scientist begins a scientific method with a hypothesis. It's not a thing, it's an imagined thing. And then they test the hypothesis. And if they discover something, they depict what they've discovered in models. That's not the thing itself, but it's an imaginative depiction of the thing. Mm-hmm. Even theology develops along those lines as well. All theology, Walter Elwell, the theologian, used to say, all theology is approximation. And we always seek better and better approximations. You look at the history of the church. We've got the first council in Acts 15. Mm-hmm. And we see a model there. If the church wants to solve a controversy, let's get together and get more eyes on the thing if we can. But then during the Roman persecution, you had a lot of heresies that were developing. So now let's solve these things. What are we going to do? Is Jesus really God? So they met at Nicaea. It was interesting. I was just at Nicaea about 3 weeks ago. Just a fairly nondescript place, but something that still is rippling through church history happened at that place. They got together and they formed a Trinitarian understanding of biblical revelation captured in theological doctrine. But it wasn't enough because the controversy still went on. Okay, if Jesus is God, how do we reconcile the two natures of Christ, his human and his divine? So they have the Council of Constantinople in 381. They have the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And it's through this imaginative development, even of theological doctrine, to try to understand this stuff. We imagine something, then we go back to the scriptures to see if what we've imagined has merit or not. And Lewis is not afraid to do that. And consequently, then, his faith is not static and inert. It's dynamic, and it's dynamic and orthodox. So it stays rooted in scripture, but it's developing in its application and understanding. It's wonderful.
How do we hold on to that? I mean, how do we cultivate a similar Christian imagination now?
I think, one, we have to not be afraid to ask questions and not be afraid of our doubts. I tell my students, if you have no questions about your faith, you're delusional. You think you've achieved omniscience. We're pea brains. We're trying to understand and grow. And you can't grow unless you lean into the things you don't understand. And in leaning in, you may come up with a misdiagnosis or a misunderstanding. That's why you need to do it in community. 60% of the word you in New Testament Greek is plural. Now, part of that's pragmatic, right? They didn't have printing, so people would come to the church to hear the reading of scripture and so on. So the letters were written to a community. But also, I think still it should be written to a community. We should understand it in community. None of us can do really great theology in isolation from others. We need to do it in isolation. And I would say something about that too, in light of evangelism. I don't know what this is. I remember one time I thought, I need to tell people about Jesus. And I've always had this since I became a Christian. I was talking to people about Jesus. I still do it. I have conversations every week with non-believers about faith. And so I decided I'd go to a donut shop, and I'll just talk to people at the donut shop. I got there at 10 o'clock. Nobody's at donut shops at 10 o'clock. Maybe a cop stops by for a cup of coffee or something. If you want to go to a donut shop, you go from 6 to 8 in the morning. And you see these people dropping by for their donut and their cup of mud before they go to work. And I think you could write a doctoral dissertation on the sociological subcultures of donut shops in America. There were about 8 or 10 little tables at this donut shop, chairs around them. Every day I'd go, I'd see people sitting at the same table, same people, same table, all that stuff. I didn't have any strategy. I was a doofus. I had a heart. I was praying for the people at the donut shop. My strategy was this stupid. I thought I'd go have my Greek Bible there. I'd be reading my Greek Bible. Somebody come in and say, "What's that?" I'd say, "It's a Greek Bible." They'd say, "Oh, can I ask Jesus in my heart?" That's how stupid I was. And there was this guy who would come into the donut shop every day, and I would just go on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He'd come in. And he looked like Walter Matthau. Remember that actor?
Yeah.
I looked like he'd either been weaned on a dill pickle or baptized in lemon juice. I mean, he had a scowl on his face. And he'd walk in and I'd say hi to him. He would scowl at me and he'd sit at a table just to my right every day. Never said a word to me. I'd say, hi, good to see you. And he'd say, I had in my prayer book, the grumpy guy.
Mm.
One day I'm reading in my Greek Bible and all of a sudden I hear somebody say, "Can I sit here?" And it was the grumpy guy. I said, "Yeah, what's your name?" He said, "Gene." I said, "What do you do for a living, Gene?" He says, "Why? Are you writing a book?" And I made a dumb mistake. I asked too much too soon.
Mm.
And I realized you can ask a public question of a person, "What's your name?" And this donut shop was in Whittier, California. I could have said, "Are you from Whittier?" It's a public question. It's not intrusive. He's in Whittier. And then you listen to the answer, and the answer lets you go deeper with the next question because the answer gives you permission to ask about the data. They said, one time I met a guy, I said, "What's your name?" He said, "Peter." I was in Chicago. I said, "Are you from Chicago?" He said, "No, I grew up in Albuquerque, but when my parents divorced, I moved with my mom to Chicago." He didn't have to tell me that. He gave me permission to ask about that. And eventually, as we asked deeper and deeper questions, and he gave deeper and deeper answers, I knew how to share the gospel with him in a way that would be heard because I got to that place. Now, with Gene, I screwed up. I didn't know this then. And a lot of times what happens is if we share our faith with somebody and it doesn't go well, we just say, I'm out of here. This is too difficult. I don't want to do this and stuff. We don't treat any other area in our life like that. If you're married and you get married and it's all great fun and stuff, and then all of a sudden you have a little spat, you say, "Well, this is a little more complex than I thought it was going to be." Do you bail on your marriage? You have troubles with your kids? Do you bail on your kids? The first time you go to work and you've never worked at that place and you make a mistake, do you say, "Okay, this is nuts. I'm never going to do this again. It's too complex"? No. Why do we treat evangelism different than any other area in our life? And I don't understand this thing. But anyway, I've moved a million miles away from whatever question you answered. But did you notice I was able to work in what I wanted to say?
Yeah, no, that was awesome. I want to go back to the evangelism part. You said something that I've heard you say before. You said you give a public answer, and then if something in public that you can agree upon, meaning that he's in Whittier, California, you can talk about Whittier, California, because that's a public thing. But when you went into Gene's, what do you do for a living? He hadn't revealed that yet. So it was private. Therefore, you skipped the process. So go back to that for a moment, because I think that's pretty profound. Describe this process that you use when you go through, when you evangelize.
Well, first off with Gene, though, I realized I went too fast.
Mm-hmm.
But it ended up that every Tuesday, Thursday after that, he started sitting with me. And we started going deeper. And in time, I found out he was a guy who had twice been married, had no clue where his former wives were, had 2 kids in the world, had no clue where they were. Have you ever heard of a deadbeat dad? Dean was the guy, and guess what? God loves deadbeat dads. And if we're not in context where we can meet those guys to tell them of the love of God, they may still hear it. I think God engineered Gene and I meeting. He became a Christian 9 months later, but it took time, and I had to learn from my mistakes. But Gene was a good teacher. In a sense, he hung in there with me. He didn't reject me when I went too fast, too soon. But another example would be, I was coming back from Slovakia. I was in Bratislava giving some C.S. Lewis lectures over spring break, and I had to fly back to Wheaton because I had classes after spring break. And the people dropped me off at the Vienna airport, which is only about 45 minutes from Bratislava. I check in my luggage. I go through passport control and I go into where I was waiting for the gate area. And I'm told the flight's 3 hours delayed. I love the anonymity of airports. I pull out a book, I start reading. I see this young woman walking into the gate area, and she's got a clipboard and a lanyard, and she's going up to people, and I can hear her talking in German. Vienna's a German-speaking city. I figure she's doing a survey for the airport. Sure enough, a moment later, she comes up to me and she speaks in flawless English, and it gave me great insecurity. What was I wearing that gave it away I wasn't German speaking? Then I realized, I was reading a book. She probably saw it was in English and spoke to me in that language. She said she was doing a survey for the airport. And I said, what's your name? Public question. She said, Allegra. I said, Allegra, are you from Vienna? She said, no, I grew up in Southern Austria. Oh, well, what brought you to Vienna? Public question. She's in Vienna. And she says, I'm a student. So now I've got a billion questions I could ask. Where do you go to school? What are you studying? And you follow that line of questioning all the way through. And then I say, do you have any other family in Southern Austria? Only my father, and he's a very bitter man.
Mm.
Why is he so bitter, Allegra? She didn't have to tell me that. Well, my mother left him to go with her lover to Canada, but she had good reason to leave him. He's very toxic. And so we could talk about her relationship with her father for a while and find out how that was troubled and difficult. I said, well, do you have any other family members? She says, a brother. Where's he, Allegra? He's also at the University of Vienna. Well, do you have much relationship with him? No, we're kind of estranged too. And then she goes, and it's worse than that. I said, how's that, Allegra? She said, my boyfriend went to Florence to study art for 6 months and asked me to wait for him. I waited dutifully. He came back yesterday to tell me he met somebody better in Florence. Here's a woman whose whole life is full of estrangements, relationship longing, but vacuous as far as the reality. I know how to share the gospel with her. I know the place where when I shoot the arrow, it won't be at hazard aimed. It will be aimed at the target, because I could talk with her about the God who wants to reconcile us to him and have a relationship with him because he loves us. So finally, 20 minutes I've been asking her questions. She hasn't asked me one question. I said, Allegra, and I know her life. I said, Allegra, you need to ask your questions. But I said, but I need you to know I've been sent here to tell you something. Then she thought I was a plant at the airport to see if she was doing her job. I said, no, it has nothing to do with that. So she asked me her questions. How long did it take me to check in, get through passport control, all the things you'd expect. Finally, she says, what is it you were sent here to tell me? And I think every one of us needs to realize we are people who are called to Christ and sent into the world. Come and go, Jesus says. Mm. Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Go into the world to make him known. So she said, what were you sent here to tell me? I said, Allegra, the God of the universe knows you and he loves you. Allegra, he loves you. Sometimes you have to say it 3 times for it to fit in. Allegra, he loves you and he won't abandon you. And she just started sobbing in the airport. Loud sobs. Everybody's looking at me as if I'm torturing this poor girl, you know. And she says to me, volunteers herself, but I've done so many bad things with my life. I said, oh, Allegra, he knows about every one of them. And so great is his love that he has forgiven you of all of it. And he longs to have a relationship with you. She heard it. She heard it because you went slow and you listened to her. You asked appropriate questions. And I don't think we take Jesus to anybody. He's already there, more in love with that person than you and I will ever be. We go to make explicit what God might be doing already as he's tugging at their hearts. But we have to listen and we have to ask appropriate questions. We have to go deeper and so on. And sometimes you can get along in that process, and then the person will be dismissive of you, you know. And there's different kinds of ways you ask questions, you know, and different kinds of protocols, I think, for evangelism with friends, say, with acquaintances, or cold turkey, just going out into the community. But I think if we listen, Lewis helps us there too, because Lewis is the liberal arts guy.
Mhm.
A better broad understanding of life and the liberal arts and ideas and so on gives us more connecting places with another person that we might meet. I can give you examples of that too, but maybe we need to go a different direction.
No,
Sure.
I am curious, going as you're talking about evangelism and you're talking about Lewis, how did Lewis understand evangelism?
Well, I mean, I think he says that God does things in the coarse publicity of human endeavor, and it acts things about which we must talk about. He says this in the introduction to the Socratic Club at Oxford, the first meeting. Socratic Club was set up where non-Christians would read a paper one week, and the not a non-Christian would read a paper and the Christians would respond. Next week, a Christian would read a paper and the non-Christians would respond. It was just this ongoing debate, and many people came and read papers there. Some of the leading academics in the English-speaking world at that time would come. But Lewis said, these are things we must talk about. God did this. God did this in our world, and it's something that we should not be quiet about. And Lewis himself in his own life engaged in these sorts of things. I don't think he considered his gift as a gift of evangelism, but I think that it doesn't make any difference what your gift is. We don't get a pass on evangelism any more than we get a pass on giving, even if we don't have the gift of making. You know, all the gifts, all the areas of giftedness in the scriptures, we're all called to function in. Some people have a special aptitude for a particular one. But Lewis had a serious relationship with Christ, and he wanted people to know about him. So how does he do it? He engages in the Socratic Club at Oxford University. His letter writing, he was clearly evangelistic in many of his letters if he's writing to non-Christians. You had the BBC broadcast that became Mere Christianity, where he's publicly doing these things. World War II, he was out ministering to the RAF airmen who were dying by droves, but he felt an obligation to come and share the gospel with them before they died. He would talk with some of his students. He would talk in ministries in various ways. He would preach at churches. He was out there doing these things, and sometimes took flack for it among his academic community too. But he felt that the need to share about the love of Christ transcended anything that was for him a career interest, whereby he would take his career interest and say, forget the gospel, I've got my career to run. That's pretty courageous, I think, on his part.
I think so too.
Yeah, and I think he learned in the process too. You know, he was a
How many books did Lewis write?
Well, he wrote 73 books. He wrote
73
56
books.
of them, 56 of them in his lifetime, and the others he wrote after he died. What happened was Walter Hooper, who had been his literary executor, took essays that had common themes and put them under common cover. A lot of these were put together after he died. Also, he was a tremendous letter writer. I used to own a letter where he said, I answer all my mail. And he would even write to his regular correspondence, and he would say, please don't write me around Christmas. I get so many letters. He might get 1,000 letters. He'd answer every one.
Oh my gosh.
And consequently, as a result of that, people kept his letters because the content was so good. And his brother kept a file of all the people Lewis corresponded to with their name, their address, and the date when he wrote him a letter. And Warren Lewis gave that file to Clyde Kilby, who started the Wade Center at Wheaton College, which is the largest collection of C.S. Lewis material in the world. So Kilby had the file with the names and addresses and all the letters. And he went and asked those people, would you be willing to give your letters to a research center on C.S. Lewis? Many of them did. Some of them, he said, if not, would you let us copy them so that they would be preserved for humanity, you know, for literary studies?
Yeah.
And many of them did. Some of them, he said, would you leave them after you die? Many of them did. Some of them, he'd say, well, would you allow me to find a businessman who would be willing to pay you for them so we could put them in the Wade Center? And many of them did. So there's 8 volumes of letters that Lewis wrote.
Wow.
The Cadillac, of course, are the 3 edited by Walter Hooper. But you've got others as well. There's letters to children, letters to an American lady. There's letters to Arthur Greaves. Some of these are contained also in the Hooper edited collection. But nevertheless, so it's 73 books. Every once in a while, you'll see something else that's published, usually in the journal 7. If somebody's a real big Lewis fan, they should probably subscribe to that journal 7 out of Wheaton College. And then there's another one called Sainsucht that comes out of Arizona. Bruce Johnson is the editor of that. And these are, sometimes they'll publish something new that just came out about Lewis, something that he wrote, people have seen.
We know about him being a writer. We know that he wrote across genres, but a lot of people don't know necessarily a lot about his prayer life. He did write about prayer, of course, but I found a book written some time ago. I don't remember how many years now at the top of my head, but it talked about his prayer life. What was his prayer life like?
Well, you've got Letters to Malcolm chiefly on prayer.
Right.
And it's basically his sequel to Screwtape Letters. So Screwtape Letters is one half of a correspondence between one demon and another demon talking about how to tempt somebody. When he wrote that book, he said in the preface to the second edition, his goal was to write a second book, one angel writing to another angel on how to elevate and encourage somebody, nudge them towards sanctification. Lewis said, who could ever write the second book? We're all closer to the diabolical than we are to the divine. So in a less pretentious way, one of the last 2 books he wrote before he died is this Letters to Malcolm chiefly on prayer. And it's one side of a correspondence, fiction correspondence, of a friend writing to another friend on how to encourage him in the Christian faith. It's not angelic, it's human. So that's a significant book. And he writes a lot about prayer there. He writes about prayer too in Reflections on the Psalms, a book that he does. It's the only thing close to a commentary by C.S. Lewis. But the Psalms, many of them are prayers. They're poems and they're prayers. And so he gives comment about prayer in those books. But he's got other essays too. The Problem of Petitionary Prayer. He's got a bunch of essays on this as well. And there probably are books out about Lewis's prayer life. There's certainly books about his devotional life. And there's one by Lyle Dorset, Seeking God in the Secret Place. And it's about Lewis's prayer life as well. And Lyle's a very reliable C.S. Lewis scholar. So those are different places where you could go. But basically, Lewis he maintained his private life. He read in the scriptures every day. He would get up early in the morning and read in the scriptures. He'd spend time in prayer. And then he would go on Addison's Walk, which is a walk behind Magdalen College, and he would say his prayers while he was walking. Then he'd go to chapel, morning chapel at Magdalen College, and then he'd go to breakfast, and then he'd start his work day. But he was up every morning, and he would read the King James Version. He read Moffat's translation, and then he would often he read in his Greek Bible every day as well. So the personal devotional life of Lewis was something very central to his life. I mean, he had unique gifts. All of us can do the devotion thing and grow by virtue of it. I don't think all of us have a photographic memory like Lewis had and so on. I mean, he marshaled his gifts for kingdom purposes. We could see a model in that, whatever your gifts are, to marshal them also for kingdom purposes. But Lewis was pretty diligent about that. He also said, though, that he sometimes prayed visually. So he didn't necessarily use words. He would pray for people by imagining their face. Maybe it was a waitress at a restaurant where he was at, and he would imagine her face and be praying for her imaginatively. And I don't know exactly how he did it, but he writes about this. And it's interesting. He had his habits and was faithful. He had long lists, though. He would pray for a person he met on a train. He would pray for a student. He would pray. It was a big part of his life, but it was something that seemed to be ongoing throughout his day.
Well, I remember the book that I can't remember the book off the top of my head, but it talked about his driver. He had a driver, and he
Clifford Moore.
Yeah, and he'd made a comment, or Clifford was trying to get into a conversation with him, and he said, not today. I need to pray while you drive. Yeah.
Clifford Morris was the guy. He mentions him in Letters to Malcolm chiefly on prayer. He talks about the fact that he was reading the work of a Scottish divine named Alexander White, and he goes, Morris led him to me. And I heard an interview with Clifford Morris years after Lewis had died. And he said, I'm the guy that Lewis mentioned there. I'm the one who lent him the Alexander White thing. And Morris talked about the fact that Lewis would sometimes say that. They had good conversations. Morris even said on their drive from Oxford to Cambridge, because Lewis continued to live in Oxford when he was teaching at Cambridge University, Morris would pick him up and take him. And he said they would usually stop someplace along the way, to go to the bathroom or have a cup of tea or something like that. And he said there was sometimes they would stop at this pub. And the pubs in England are interesting. If it's a local pub, it's usually like the neighborhood living room. You'd meet your neighbors not in their home, but at the pub. And you'd have a beer and you'd talk or whatever. And in Oxford, when we lived there, I noticed that a lot of the pubs took on a certain personality. So this pub might be all the taxi drivers. This pub might be all the Oxford Brookes students. This pub might be many of the Oxford students. This pub might be where the Oxford dons and teachers would go. And then you'd get a little bit outskirts and it would be the local pub where the people who lived in that neighborhood would hang out and so on. So Morris said that they would be driving to Cambridge, and he said he knew this one pub where the lorry drivers, the truck drivers would stop. And Lewis would be in there and he'd order a beer and they'd be talking, and Lewis would have them all in stitches. They'd be laughing. He's a very, very humorous guy. And he'd go to the toilet and these guys would say to Morris, who is that guy? What a regular guy. What a good guy. They knew he had a sort of posh accent. They say, born with a plum in their mouth or something like that, or a silver spoon in their mouth. Lewis was kind of upper class guy, but they saw he was just a regular guy. He could connect with even the working class. And that's again, Lewis being faithful to what he said in The Weight of Glory, where he wrote, there are no ordinary people. You've never met a mere mortal. And Lewis says, everybody is either moving to become one day an everlasting horror or an everlasting glory. And the weight of glory is that we have a responsibility to each person we meet. I read through the Bible every year. I've been doing it. I don't know. I'm at the 55th read through it or something like that. And I've read the New Testament 39 times besides that, Greek Bible twice. I'm not a great Greek scholar, but I can read it if I have a lexicon near my elbow to look up the occasional word I don't know. But one of the things I've noticed when I was reading through the Bible one year, years ago, I got to Chronicles, chapters 1 through 12. And I'm saying, Lord, you're omniscient. You know everything. And yet, though you're omniscient, you only gave us one thin little book compared to what you could have given us. Was 12 chapters of names in the first 12 chapters of Chronicles good economical use of the space? I've never heard an audible word from God, but I often get these prompts. And at that moment, the prompt was, to you, they're just names. But every one represented somebody I loved deeply. If you could have only known Simeon. Yeah, I know he wasn't very nice to his brother Joseph, but he felt like he was the unloved son of his father Jacob. He had vicissitudes going on in his heart, and I knew every one of them. If you could have only known, Naomi, when she had lost her husband and her 2 sons, and she didn't want her daughters-in-law to go with her, but Ruth stayed with her. There were vicissitudes going on in her heart and life and struggles. I knew her, and I realized to me they were 12 chapters of names, but God doesn't just love people generically. He loves particular people, individual people. Every time I read through Chronicles 1 through 12, I remind myself about how great and deep and broad and particular is God's love for people. And you have it in 1 John 4, it says God is love, very explicit. And the interesting thing to me is if God is love, that means he never stopped loving Satan either. Matter of fact, Satan's incorrigibility doesn't diminish God's character. God is love. The tragedy of Satan is not a deficiency in God's love. The tragedy of Satan is that somebody like Satan would become so incorrigible that he would reject a hand that's always outstretched to him, to the place of moral blindness,
Mhm.
acrasia again, like we had talked about, in the place of utter reprobation. And it should be a warning to us that any of us can move in that direction if we step away from the love of God that's always reaching out to us. Very powerful stuff, I think.
You talk about history, and we had a bit of a conversation earlier about historians. So there was a 40-year class reunion. Share that story for our listeners, because I think it's one that will make people laugh, but also kind of open our eyes a bit to see where we're at today.
Well, they had these three guys who all graduated from Wheaton in the same year. And it was Nathan Hatch, was a historian and became provost at Notre Dame, and later became president at Wake Forest University. You had Mark Knoll, this eminent church historian, Martin Marty, who was a great church historian at University of Chicago, once said to me, Mark Knoll is not America's greatest church historian, he's America's greatest historian.
Wow.
And then you had John Piper, the great preacher.
Pastor, yeah.
And if you read Desiring God, I love his Desiring God and so on. But he's a pastor, he's a preacher.
Mm-hmm.
And my understanding of historians is they're kind of like Ents. If you've read Tolkien, the Ents are the tree shepherds, and they have long, long life. And the life of man to them is like the life of a gnat to us as humans. And they look at everything with the long view. They don't get too upset about what's happening in the moment because they're historians. So here are these three historians. It was so funny, the gathering, because it was the 40th anniversary of their graduation. They're going to have this thing in Barrows Auditorium. It's one of the large, it's not the largest auditorium at Wheaton, but it's a large one. And they ended up starting 20 minutes late. And Catherine Long, who was a church historian at Wheaton at the time, she said, "You'll have to pardon us for starting so late. We historians aren't used to a lot of people coming to our gatherings." So we had to set up video rooms throughout the building so that we have place for the overflow. So these three guys were assigned to talk about what the church was like 40 years earlier and what the church was like today. And Mark Knoll and Hatch, they're historians. And so they're saying, well, there were things in the past that were good and there were things that were bad. A little bit like, Charles Dickens in Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. And there are things today that are bad and there are things today that are good. There's some things that are better. There were Piper. No, man. He's got the prophetic finger pointed out and about how the world's going to hell in a handbasket and how bad everything is and so on. And I mean, he's pointing out legitimate things, but the thing is, he's saying it's just so crazy. And he says one of the worst things is that these kids are so out of touch. They're in their social media. They don't even have connection with each other. They put their earbuds in. They're listening to their iPhones and all that other stuff. And Hatch interrupts him and he says, John, I know what you're saying. The biggest group at Wake Forest is the evangelical group. And I often go to their worship services myself. I get so much out of them. And you're right. As soon as they're done, they put in their earbuds and they go on their way listening to John Piper sermons. But there it is.
What did he do? Did he say anything? John Piper, did he say anything?
Everybody laughed, and he's got good humor. He laughed well. One moment. But the thing is, though, a Christian view, we're not dualists as Christians. Mm. We believe good is primary, evil is a perversion of the good. Mm-hmm. And so consequently, we're not dualistic. It's not an equal and opposite evil and bad. So everything that's out there has a good use. And consequently, too, it can be perverted. Mm. But you can't think of a bad banana without thinking of a good banana that goes bad. Right. Evil compares to good like bread mold compares to bread. Mm-hmm. But we as humans, made in the image of God, we could do creative things with that bread mold. We can make penicillin out of it. Will we not at least give God that level of creativity where he could take the worst event in human history, which was not suicide, it was not homicide, it was not regicide or genocide, it was deicide. We killed God when God became a man, right?
Mm.
And consequently, God takes that horrible act and he turns it on itself and makes divine penicillin out of it. He makes the healing of all the nations in Christ.
Mm.
And I think it's pretty remarkable. But I think we have to think about it too, as far as man's nature is concerned too. I talk with people all the time, and I'll say, Christians, good Christians, who should know better. I'll say, do you believe man's sinful by nature, or do you believe man's good by nature? And they all, almost 98% of the time, they'll say, no, I believe he's sinful by nature. I say, how do you justify that with your theology? Man is sinful in nature. You need to use the prepositions carefully. Sin is an encroachment. It's not something that is part of human nature. It's something that has shown how human nature has become corrupted. But you look at your theology, and at least 4 areas, your theology is affected by your view of man. Your theology proper, your doctrine of man, of God. If man is sinful by nature, God would have had to have created us sinful. But the scriptures tell me there's no darkness in him at all, that God is good. So therefore, he couldn't have created us bad. We are made in the image of God. The imago Dei is what our nature is. Then your doctrine of Christ. Did Jesus become sinful when he became a man? If sin's essential to human nature, Jesus would have had to become sinful. But he becomes a man without sin, tested in all points as we, yet without sin. Sin wasn't present in his human nature. Then you have 4 categories of man in your biblical anthropology. Adam and Eve before the fall, no sin. Adam and Eve and all who follow after the fall, sin. There's the encroachment. We're in that category ourselves. I'm weary of it all, frankly. I long to have it flushed. Then you've got Christ in his humanity, no sin, and you got man in his glorified state. Eventually it will be flushed. I can't wait. I long to have this stuff leached out of me. 4 categories of man in scripture. Sin's only present one. It can't be the definitive characteristic of what it is to be human. Then you've got your soteriology, your doctrine of salvation. If you see a pig wallowing in the mire, you don't kick the pig and tell him to get out of the mire. He's living according to his nature. He doesn't have sweat glands. He wallows to keep his body cool. But if you see a man living in sin and degradation, do you tell him he shouldn't live like that? Why? If he's living according to his nature, let him go. But no, we tell him he needs Jesus because we want him to live above his fallen state. And we want him to be set on the process of not only having his sins forgiven, but set on the process of sanctification so he can grow into glorification. And here again is Lewis, you've never met a mere mortal. Every person you meet is moving towards one end or the other. And we're trying to help them to get back to the restoration of the image of Christ. Sinful in nature, not sinful by nature.
That's a very important distinction, and one, quite honestly, that I had not
it is,
heard of.
Travis, it is, Travis, because if I don't have it, I'll find it easy to treat people who are living in sin as if they're just dirt bags. I should never treat anybody that way. Even Hitler, I can't treat that way because he was a man made in the image of God. Hitler is a tragedy because of what he did to himself and what he did to so many other people. He's a tragedy. But we should never treat anybody, no matter how bad they are. Who would have ever thought that the Apostle Paul, this Christian killer, would become one of the greatest leaders of the early church? You don't know if the person you're talking to now, no matter how despicable they are, that they might be somebody very important for God's purposes.
When go back for a moment. When you mentioned that we're sinful in nature, not sinful by nature, do you use that when you present the gospel to people? That idea?
I use what's necessary. The gospel is glorious. Its center is very easy to access. So easy that a child could understand, but so complex that even the greatest scholars spend their lifetime fascinated by it. I use the elements of the gospel that are necessary to get this person to understand that God loves them. Christ died on the cross to forgive them for their sins, and what he did reconciles them to God. I use what's necessary to get to that. If they're struggling with human nature, something, I'll bring that theological issue in. If they're struggling with the doctrine of the Trinity, I'll bring that theological issue in. If they're struggling with the two natures of Christ, I'll bring in whatever's necessary to help them see with greatest clarity what they need to see so that they could give their heart to Jesus. So sometimes I use it, sometimes I don't.
When you do your gospel presentations, the way that you described Gene in the donut shop, that sounded like it took some considerable time.
It did.
When you do your gospel presentations, and I'm sure that there's a spectrum here, but do you find that it takes a lot more time? I mean, it seems like you have taken that tact that this isn't just a one-time conversation thing. Now, we do have those moments, of course, where that's all we have in that moment. But it seems more often than not, just according to what I know about you, you seem to try to stay in one place over time and build a relationship over time to kind of chip away. Would I be wrong in that assessment?
Well, there's all kinds of people you meet in all kinds of circumstances, and the gospel should be able to be communicable in all of those circumstances. So it's not uniform. I'll give you an example. I was reading a paper on C.S. Lewis at a theology conference down in San Antonio, Texas. And I got in the plane. I'm sitting by the window. And this guy comes and sits in the middle seat. And he says, "Rats, I've got a middle seat." If I'd have been really spiritual, I'd have said, "Oh, if you want, you can have my window seat." But I didn't do that. A minute later, a guy comes and sits on the aisle seat. And he says, "Professor Root." And I go, "You got the drop on me. I'm sorry. I don't think I know you." He says, "I was at the paper you read at the theology conference." So this guy and I start talking theology over the guy in the middle seat. And I turned to him and I said to him, "Please forgive us. We were both at a theology conference. We were talking about theology. Please forgive us if we talk over you. Why don't you join our conversation? What's your name?" He said, "Sean." So we talked for a couple more minutes. And I turned to Sean. I say, "Sean, are you a spiritual person?" He says, I am. I said, "Tell me about that." He said, "I went and studied with a shaman in Peru once." I said, "That sounds interesting. Tell me about that." Now you could say, "Is this new age? Let's avoid this, put up the cross, keep the
right.
Or you could say, "Does this exhibit spiritual hunger?" And I'm going to assume the best, because I don't think I'm sitting next to this guy not by design. I think there's a reason I'm sitting there, and that this guy's sandwiched between two people that were just at a theology conference. And he said, "I went and studied with a shaman in Peru." I said, "Tell me about that." Well, I saw I could study with a shaman. And I saved up my money and my vacation, and I went down to Peru and I studied with this guy for 3 weeks. I said, "Well, how did that go for you, Sean?" He said, "It was the worst money I ever spent in my life." And then he says, "What's in it for you, Jerry?" And I share the gospel with him. Very, very short and clear and so on. Loved by God, forgiven by God. One of the things I like to spell out when I get to sin, I say to people, I think all of us have high ideals, and we live beneath our own ideals. I believe in the high value of love of other people. And yet I find I live beneath my value, because sometimes I have sharp words with people I say I love most in the world, or I mumble under my breath if I'm stuck in traffic about the people around me. These people don't do anything to me, but I see how, even though I say I love God and I think I should love people, I live beneath that value. Everybody lives beneath their own values, let alone then the divine transcendent values. And consequently, when you say it like that, people lean into it and they say, yeah, I struggle with that too. If they're honest, most people are honest when you talk with them. And now all of a sudden, we've established a sin thing. I could go into more detail on it. I could talk about the nature of sin and so on. But I talk about what I need to talk about so that I could get to the next point in the gospel message, which is always going to be centered in Christ. So Sean, I share the gospel with him briefly. And he says to me, "That's the most comforting thing I've ever heard in my life." I said, "Sean, is there any reason why you wouldn't want to trust Christ right now?" He said, "None." And he prays with me out loud on that flight, 15 minutes into the flight. The guy sitting on the aisle, he's just freaking out.
That would have been me. I would have been doing the same thing.
He was doing his doctorate at Trinity Seminary in apologetics. He's used to building scaffolding for the gospel. He's not used to obstetrics, seeing somebody else. And
Spiritual obstetrics.
this guy on the aisle is freaking out, and he turns to Sean and loves on him and begin to speak about growing in Christ, about getting in the Word, about prayer, about getting into a fellowship someplace, and so on. And it was so glorious to watch this guy on the aisle nurturing him. So we get Sean's address. He lived in, the guy on the aisle and I were both flying to Chicago, and Sean was going to go on to Toronto. But we get his address. We send him some stuff. We find out some churches in the area that we could get him connected with that were good churches and so on. You try to follow up wherever you can. You can't always follow up completely. But that was an encounter on a plane, one-time meeting with the guy. There are many encounters where you have ongoing relationship with people. So there was a guy who was a mailman, came to my house. His name was Steve. I always offer the toilet to whoever my mailman is. I don't know what those guys do when they're on their route, But Jesus said the cup of cold water can sometimes be valuable. I think sometimes any common human act of kindness is good. And so I got to know Steve over time. And as I got to know him, one day I shared the gospel with him and he trusted Christ. So I invited him to church on Sunday and he said, well, Jerry, I'm divorced and I have my kids on the weekend. I don't think it would be so good, And I said, well, our church has great stuff for kids. I'll bet your kids would love it. Why don't you come to church and afterwards, why don't you and your kids come over for dinner? And he came over to the house and his kids trusted Christ that day over lunch. These rippling effects, they go out. It doesn't always go well, but you don't know if you're sharing Christ at all, you have to believe these things are being engineered from a higher source, from someplace on high. And you have to believe that maybe this person's going to have 15 people talk to him before they come to Christ, and you're number 8 in the process. And are there ever times when we hear about this and see what the rippling effects are or how the person came to faith later? So I've got a couple of examples. I was working in college. I had to put myself through college, but this one summer I was asked by the YMCA to run their day camp in the summer and run the week-long residential camp up in the mountains. And I said to the Y people, okay, I'd be happy to do this, but in the story time, I want to use Bible stories. And in the day camp, the last week of day camp, Friday, they would have an overnight at the park. We'd have a hot dog feed. We'd have a campfire, story time, skits and stuff. And in the morning, we had a pancake breakfast and the kids would go on their way. And in the residential camp, every night we had a campfire. And the last night, I wanted to be able to share the gospel. And I asked the YMCA guys, can I do this? And they said, well, nobody could say they couldn't see it coming because it's Young Men's Christian Association. Mm-hmm. You can, but you can't follow them up. Well, at that time in my life, I wouldn't have known how to follow somebody up. We saw about 540 decisions for Christ that summer. But what happened to them? And we did this residential camp up in the mountains at this camp called Little Green Valley YMCA camp. And I would pray for them. I would agonize for those kids over the years. I'd say, Lord, watch out for them. I was trying to be faithful in that environment. Please, please, Lord, watch out over your sheep. Well, fast forward many years later as a youth pastor in the suburbs, not in the inner city where that YMCA was. This kid comes to youth group. I haven't seen him before. And I said, what's your name? He said, Mike. I said, Mike, you look new here. He says, I am new. My family just moved into the area and I met some Christians at my high school and they said they came to this youth group. So I came to the youth group. I said, well, Mike, are you a Christian? He says, yeah. I said, what's your story? He said, well, when I was a kid, I was up at a YMCA camp in the mountains. And he said, our family was going to leave on family vacation the next day. And we wanted to leave before the buses got back with all the kids. So my dad drove up the night before. And then we left at dark 30 Saturday morning. And he said that night, the director of the camp, I don't even know who he was. He got up and he shared the gospel. And my dad and I both trusted Christ. We went on family vacation. When we came back, we started going to church. And it wasn't long after that, my mom and my 2 sisters came to faith. I said, Mike, what was the name of that camp? He said, Little Green Valley YMCA camp. I said, what was the YMCA you went up with? He said, it was the Southeast YMCA in Huntington Park, California. I said, Mike, I was the director of that camp.
Wow.
And I said, Lord, thank you for letting me see that you did not abandon those kids. And we both worship God, what we discovered. I have many stories like that, by the way.
Wow.
The frequency with which I share Christ, you begin to hear some of these things later. God's at work, and we're just his ambassadors. We're working for the King. And consequently, you feel the prompt to share Jesus with somebody and it doesn't go well, you don't know the end of that story. And it may be that the end of the story is that will be held against the person because they won't be able to say in glory when they rejected Jesus that they never had a chance to hear. In Scripture, there'll be those gathered before the throne from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. It says God has not left himself without witness. But one of the ways he works is through us. And consequently, we need to be faithful to the call, and we need to be faithful to the Holy Spirit's prompts in our life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes huge sense. I wanted to, because we're running out of time. I want to thank you for being so generous with your time. But you've worked with a lot of students. You've seen a lot of shifts of the culture, and you have, as I said at the onset, quote unquote, retired. But what are your words to the younger generation that's coming up? What is your encouragement to them as they're embarking on this Christian life that seems to be captured by political rhetoric in the culture, cancel culture, and deconstruction going on all around them? What is your encouragement to them?
Well, it's interesting. I'll say something that I think is central to it, and then maybe make a few applications. So about 3 weeks before Lewis died, he got a letter from an 11-year-old girl in America. She wrote to him through his publisher. He gets this basically on his deathbed. It's one of the last things he writes before he dies. This great Christian on the threshold of heaven, writing to this little girl on the threshold of her earthly life. And he says to her, if you continue to love Jesus, nothing much will go wrong with you. And I pray you may always do so. I would say that to anybody, but especially young people today. You hear a lot of times about how people turned away from God because of some Christian or some church that performed poorly. That's not a person that loved Jesus. That's a person that was expecting too much from a human agency that would fail. Everybody in the scriptures, except for maybe Daniel and Joseph, everybody in the scriptures could have introduced themselves in some sort of a recovery group. Hi, my name's Noah and I'm a drunk. Hi, my name's Abraham. I'm a liar and a coward. I would tell a lie that would put my life at risk rather than risk anything myself. Hi, we're Isaac and Rebecca and we're dysfunctional parents. Hi, my name's Miriam. I'm jealous of my little brother Moses, and I'm a racist. I'm upset about his interracial marriage. Hi, my name's Aaron. I'm a religious leader, but I caved to peer pressure. Hi, my name's Moses. I'm a hothead and a murderer. Struggles with his temper. Called the most humble man in the world, but struggles with his temper to the degree he doesn't get in the promised land because of it. Yeah. Hi, my name is a Rahab, and I'm a harlot. Hi, my name's Samson. I struggle with lust. Hi, my name's Naomi, and I'm bitter. Hi, my name's David. I'm an adulterer and a murderer. Hi, my name's Solomon. I'm supposed to be wise, but I'm very intemperate. Hi, my name's Elijah, and I struggle with depression. Hi, my name's Thomas, and I struggle with doubts. Hi, my name's Peter. I let down my best friend at a time he needed me most. Hi, my name's Paul, and I'm a Christian killer, and I'm really hard to work with. We're all messed up. We can always find somebody that we could blame for our willingness to step away from Jesus. But the question is, who is Jesus to you? And if you love Jesus, you can pray for the people who hurt you. You can pray for the people who fall short. You don't have to be surprised that some pastor of some big church goes off the rails. Matter of fact, even think, have you ever gone off the rails? Have there ever been times when you have not done well? Peter denies Jesus. Was there never a time in your life where you lived a little bit short of your own conviction? You're looking in the wrong place if you're letting those things distract you. That's why Lewis could say, I pray that you will continue to love Jesus. And if you do, nothing much will go wrong with you. And I think that's where people need to be. And if I begin to think that politics are the solution, I have my political views, I have my concerns. I'm going to vote based on certain convictions that I have. But I do not make a God out of politics. Politics aren't going to save my soul and give me the hope of eternal life. Jesus will. And so consequently, be politically engaged. I think you should. Some people say, well, I hate politics. I say, be careful there, because now you're not being Christian in that judgment. Because again, Christianity believes that things are good, and that in this good world, there are things that are fallen. Evil is a perversion of the good. But I say to them, have you ever felt lonely before? Oh, yeah, of course I have. Have you ever felt lonely in a crowd? Because if you felt lonely and even felt lonely in a crowd, you're probably a sociological being. You're made for community. The fact that you can communicate tells you you're made for community. Are communities better if they're chaotic, or are they better if they're organized and run well? If you're a communal person, you're also a political person by nature. Don't castigate politics. Politics aren't bad. Bad politics are bad. If you want good politics, you probably need Jesus in the center of them. C.S. Lewis said the greatest political activity a Christian can engage in is to lead their neighbor to Christ. Because if Christ reigns in that person's heart, they'll probably do better. Pascal said something similar. In the Pensée, he said, Christians have two laws better than all the laws of statecraft. Love God and love your neighbor. If I love God and love my neighbor, I'm going to want to do well by my neighbor. I don't want to hurt him. But if love grows cold, the scriptures say lawlessness increases. And if the love grows cold, instead of those two laws, love God and love your neighbor, we end up having penal codes that begin to thicken. And law libraries begin to proliferate, because we have to keep writing laws to keep people to do coercively and extrinsically, but what they would do naturally if they love God and love their neighbor. So if a person's heart changes for Christ, I lead them to Christ. There's a great political activity because it brings love in the place of lawlessness. I think that's very significant. So I would tell people that. Don't lose track of Jesus. Keep your heart and eyes focused on Jesus, and go out and serve him wherever you are. You'll never be with loss of opportunity if you keep your eyes on him.
And that is a good word. Thank you, Jerry, for your time. Thank you for your insights in C.S. Lewis and evangelism. And really, thank you for coming on the show.
Well, you say I'm retired, but I want you to know I'm on an airplane every week.
That's why I put in air quotes.
I'm just out there. So, I don't know. I love serving him, and I know that the more I age, the closer I am towards heaven. I can't wait to get there. And I can't wait to have all the brokenness in me finally fixed. But in the meantime, as long as he gives me breath in my lungs, I want to serve him. And thank you for giving me this opportunity.